The American colonists had been living under the rule of Great Britain since the founding of Jamestown in 1607. But what pushed the Americans to want to declare independence from their home country in 1776, 169 years later? If the colonists were at one point so happy and proud to be English, why would they want to one day risk their lives, property, and prosperity in order to be independent? In this lesson, you will learn the events that led American colonists to want to separate from Great Britain and create their own nation. The following are the long-term causes of the American Revolution. In the beginning, when colonists settled the new land in the Americas, Great Britain left the colonists alone to live and prosper. They took a hands-off approach to governing this new land, which was known as salutary neglect. Because England was so far away from America, England left the colonists alone to make their own decisions. This helped them grow and shape their own identity. The colonists knew they existed to provide wealth for the mother country, which was Great Britain. This economic policy was known as mercantilism. As long as the colonists sold more than they bought, had a favorable balance of trade, and provided income to Great Britain, the colonists were left alone and salutary neglect continued. The trade route, which was approved by Great Britain, was known as triangular trade. The triangular trade route was a trading pattern connecting Europe, Africa, and the 13 colonies. The bottom leg of the triangular trade route that brought slaves from Africa to the 13 colonies was known as the Middle Passage. Once England heard that the colonists had other trading partners, the Navigation Acts were put into place. The Navigation Acts were a series of laws stating that the colonists were only allowed to trade with England. The colonists had already created their own trading partners with the French and the Dutch. These were the first laws to limit the colonial trade with the countries. These were not heavily enforced until after the French and Indian War. The French and Indian War was fought between the British and the French and Indians for control of the Ohio River Valley. The British won the war, but they go into debt. This caused England to begin to enforce the Navigation Acts as well as to end the policy of salutary neglect. Once the British needed to pay off their war debt, they began taxing the colonists and imposing other restrictions on the colonists. These are considered the short-term causes of the American Revolution. The Proclamation Line of 1763 was a document that told the colonists to stay east of the Appalachian Mountains, preventing colonists from settling new lands in the Ohio River Valley. England said this was to protest the Native American land. However, the colonists felt they were being contained. Next, you will see the Stamp Act. The Stamp Act taxed all paper and other legal documents, including playing cards and newspapers. The colonists began to get upset, expressing the idea of no taxation without representation. The colonists protested these taxes on the grounds that they had no representation in Parliament. Colonists boycotted and refused to buy British goods until the acts were repealed or canceled. Two more acts were further angered the colonists were the Quartering Act, which forced the colonists to house and feed British soldiers in their homes, and the Townshend Act, which placed a tax on imported items like paint, lead, and glass, which were everyday items that colonists used. On March 5th of 1770, 5 colonists were killed by British soldiers. This was known as the Boston Massacre. This event was heavily publicized to the colonists. The newspapers spread the idea that the British were no longer protecting the colonists, but were actually willing to harm them. This was a convincing point to influence colonists to turn their backs on England and to agree to the American Revolution. After the Tea Act, where the colonists were forced to buy tea from British East India Company to prevent the company from going bankrupt, the colonists continued to boycott and protest. The Sons of Liberty dressed as Indians and snuck onto the British ships and dumped 30,000 pounds of tea in the harbor. This event is known as the Boston Tea Party. Once England got word that the colonists had destroyed the tea, which was probably about $1 million worth of tea today, the British passed a series of harsh laws to punish the colonists. England felt that Boston must pay for the tea. This initiated the Intolerable Acts of 1774, also known as the Coercive Acts. Massachusetts, under the British control, which Boston was also under martial law, the Boston harbor was shut down and more soldiers were sent to the colonies. Once this occurred, leaders of the colonies met as the First Continental Congress. These representatives wrote a letter, which was known as the Olive Branch Petition, to the king asking him to repeal the Intolerable Acts. They continued to boycott Britain until they got a response. Once the colonists realized that the king would not change, and war had to begin. The war began with the battles of Lexington and Concord. This was known as the shot heard around the world. Thomas Paine wrote the pamphlet Common Sense to convince colonists it's time to separate from England. His main points were that the colonists need to have more control because the colonies were far too far away from England for England to rule, and also the colonies would be better off without England. In the midst of the war at the Second Continental Congress, Thomas Jefferson writes the Declaration of Independence, which officially separated the colonies from England in the minds of the colonists. The Declaration of Independence was signed on July 4th of 1776. This would only be recognized by the King of England once the war ended in 1783 and the Treaty of Paris was signed.